Okay, why don't we get started? Hello, and thank you for joining this webinar today, co-hosted by the California Community Foundation and Liberty Hill Foundation. My name is Francisco Covarrubias. I'm a program manager on CCS Housing and Economic Opportunity team. I lead our housing justice initiatives that focuses on bringing community voices into our goals of increasing protection, preserving existing affordable housing, and preventing displacement and homelessness. For over 12 years now, CCF has invested in community organizing groups, affordable housing developers, policy advocates, legal service providers, community development financial institutions, and other intermediaries to help find common ground and push for solutions to address the immense affordable housing crisis in Los Angeles. We're excited to see that our community groups are continuing to engage in this important work of updating the community plans and bringing a lens of race, class into these updates. Even as they work on other campaigns and issues like renter protections and the rental burden that have caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, these community groups are continuing to push for more affordable housing solutions, not just in their community plans, but through other policy, such as Measure JJJ, which several of these groups worked on, and then also focusing on other policies, both in the state and local cities, to increase the affordable housing in our community. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to invite you all to use the chat function to have any conversations. And then if you have any questions that you want the panelists to answer, you can use the Q&A function and we'll have staff there ready with those questions for when we have that Q&A. I'll turn it over to our moderator who does not need an introduction, but I'll give him an introduction anyways. Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Equity Research Institute at USC, which provides actionable research to support community-based organizations, funders, and other stakeholders. Their data and analysis are the basis of new narratives for equity and identify new opportunities for investment, solidarity, and power building. Dr. Pastor is a very valuable partner to CCF. He and his staff have partnered with us on our housing, smart growth, and immigration portfolio for years now, and we're happy to have him. So we'll go ahead and bring him online. Great, thank you. And have him introduce himself and our panelists.
Great, thanks a lot, Francisco. Really good to be with you today. I'm about to share in a minute about why I'm so excited about this conversation today. But yeah, we've at the Equity Research Institute are swimming in many lanes of many pools. But one of them is about how to think about equity in terms of our cities and in terms of our urban form and in terms in particular of city planning, of urban planning, of community planning. And we wrote a report some years ago called Measures Matter, looking at how you can gauge progress through an equity lens. And when writing that, we talked about the fact that equity really has a time dimension, that equity is in part about recognizing the past, the legacies, the racist redlining, the need for reparations, how it is that history has carved our current urban landscape and how that history is still alive today. So it's a kind of call to face up to the racism of our past and to adopt an anti-racist framework going forward. The second time dimension that we called for in that report was engagement in the present. That as important it was to recognize what had happened in the past, that in the current moment, what you actually needed to do was to have full engagement of community members in the actual planning process for the future. And the last time dimension is that indeed, the future. So often people plan for the future without anticipating the worst consequences that could take place. So they imagine revitalizing a neighborhood without putting the safeguards in that would prevent displacement of the current residents as the neighborhood improves. That's a recipe for gentrification and displacement, not for development and community empowerment. So you need to pay attention to the past. You need to engage people fully in the present, and you need to be thinking about the future and how you can make sure that you do not make mistakes in a way that will result in communities that have been kept behind, being left behind as a new future is being created. And so that is why I am so excited about this session and so excited about what Central City United has been able to put together in terms of a people's plan and ongoing engagement in the planning process. I think they've done three things that are absolutely remarkable, and I hope come out very strongly in this session. First, they have a very strong anti-racist commitment. They've lifted up in the report and in their organizing the ways in which Skid Row is the result of anti-Black racist policy, the exclusions that boxed Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans into Chinatown and into Little Tokyo, which of course, as we know the history, was Bronzeville for a while as well, as that community got displaced through internment/concentration camps here in the United States. So very clear recognition of our racist past and our need to reckon with that racist past and to create a vision for the future in which the notion of the right to the city, that is that people who live in this area deserve a right to be able to continue to live in this area, to thrive, for the nonprofits to thrive and the businesses to thrive. This is deeply rooted in what Central City United is doing. So they're getting that right. The second thing that they've gotten right is bridging. They have taken three communities, Skid Row, Little Tokyo, and Chinatown, which are very distinct and different in their histories, although they do share a history of exclusion. And they've created bridges between these three different neighborhoods, which do have some common needs and do have different needs. But they've done the kind of bridge building that so many of us want to see happen in the city of Los Angeles, in our progressive circles between our communities. And third, and this is the part that excites me as a complete nerd, is that you're going to hear a little bit about vision and rhetoric and principles today. But if you dive into this plan, the details are very well thought through. And what it reflects is a deep commitment on the part of the groups that have done this work to develop grassroots expertise, and as well as highlighting grassroots voice. So it's not just a question of making sure that the community speaks to or through experts. It's been a question of developing expertise at a grassroots level. So they've gotten right the commitment to understanding the past. They've gotten right the need to bridge between communities in the present, and they've gotten right all of the nerdy details, because believe me, as I was going through their plan, I found myself having to look up some of the planning rules that they were referring to, because these are my people committed to social justice and yet very nerdy. So let me introduce them. I'm going to introduce, and then if you could come off camera. I know General Dogon, you're just on a phone, so you don't need to come off that until we have you start talking. But to just introduce everyone, General Dogon is an organizer with LICAN, the Los Angeles Community Action Network. He was born and raised on Skid Row and has been working with LICAN since 2005. So talking about a grassroots voice, grassroots expertise, and right to the city that's clearly represented here. Dr. Amanda Boston is a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at New York University. Her research, writing and teaching focus on 20th century and contemporary African-American urban history and explore gentrification in her hometown of Brooklyn, New York. By the way, Dr. Boston, that's my hometown as well. I was born in Brooklyn, although I grew up in LA. So we also have Dr. Cynthia Strathmann, who is the executive director of SAJE, Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, a grassroots nonprofit so familiar to many of us, based in South LA for a long time, doing fantastic work to lift up the voices of communities, and more than lift them up, create a platform for those voices themselves to be at the center of what the planning process looks like. And then finally, what would any good conversation about planning be without a lawyer? Doug Smith is a supervising senior staff attorney at Public Counsel. He's been a legal counsel for the Street Vendor Campaign, for the South LA People's Plan, and the Central City United Coalition. He is hanging with the right folks. So everyone who's going to be part of the conversation, you can actually come off the camera and perhaps mute yourself when you're not speaking. But we'll start with a first question to General Dogon, who could come off mute. Can you talk a little bit about what have been the impacts of the past on your community of racist and equitable planning, and how that drove you or motivated you to be part of Central City United?
Yes, thank you for having me today. Sorry about the tech, but so I've been working with LA Council since 2005. And since I've been working here, it's just crazy how LA is a racist city, and it's a racial segregated city. I'm glad you said that from the beginning. Open it up. When you geographically look at the city, you see that it's broken up. You got a Greek town, African town, Chinatown, Little Tokyo, Ethiopia town. You got East LA. You know what I mean? So when you find a community that's already racially divided up, you already know it's that much easier for politicians, to do their little dirty twist. Whether they want to take something from you or give you resources, by it already being chopped up geographically, by race, then it makes it that easy. And so when you look at the black man position here in LA, you see that we went from a 90% population rate to a 9% population rate. And on top of that, black Angelinos is the most discriminated against in this city. When you look at Skid Row, you can't deny it. And so, it just double compounds, whatever we gonna get. So Skid Row is a community, 80% black folks. I say about 90% of folks is living under the poverty level. 40 to 50% have some form of a disability, and it's about 13 to 15,000 residents. And then also the impact, from with gentrification, the impacts from a lot of bad policy over the years. I would say gentrification is the main driving force, and it's all of the billions of dollars that's associated with it. That has TV leaders bending over backwards to serve the elite since 2005. I've been organizing. I personally have seen this role played out numerous of times, in and out of my district by city council members, LA police commissioners, in the mayor's office, and the mayor himself, right? I give an example of that. We had a campaign called Farmers Fear. I love the Rams. I'm a Ram fan myself, and it was about the Rams that's coming to LA. And we had to fight back against it because we don't mind the Rams coming to LA, but we don't want you bulldozing the last little affordable housing units that we have left in the area, right? Just so that we could have kickoff day at the Rams. So we had a campaign called Farmers Field, Play Fair. Right, what's the name of it? I don't want to get into too much of it, but you already know where the politics went today. Displacement and everywhere else. Some of the other impacts that's been going on. Skid Row historically has been a part of the downtown neighborhood council, right? That decide, resources, for downtown. And downtown is the dirty divide between Skid Row and the new downtown. And so for a couple of years, folks have been working on Skid Row, living on Skid Row, but working, in the downtown neighborhood council. And I know one of the Skid Row homeless coordinators, Max Steve, put in over 300 recommendations and had each one of them denied. All right. And so we can't continue to work for the other side, you know what I mean, get nothing in results. And so we decided to run our own campaign, you know what I mean, to our election to get our own downtown neighborhood council. And we did that. And at the last minute, it was city planners that changed the voter, you know, on the election, or what you can and can't do. And that last minute voters caused us to lose by like 63 votes. You know, we filed the appeal. We won some appeals, lost some appeals, but that case is still pending right now. And then, you know, one of the other things that policy, you know, gone bad on Skid Row was the launch of the Safe Cities Initiative, right, which was a police initiative that was born out of the broken windows theory of policing. And that was when Chief Bratton from New York was in L.A., and they just knew he had gentrified Times Square so good that they just knew he could do Skid Row. They had a 6-month plan to wipe out Skid Row, right? And I could sit here to New Year's and talk about all the dirty Dulo tricks LAPD and the city of Los Angeles did to criminalize and move poor black folks out of Skid Row. But here we are. We still here. Bratton and the SCI is gone. You know?
Thank you.
And so that's just a little bit of the you know, the impacts, you know, that's going to happen on Skid Row.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I think what you're lifting up is both the structural long-term stuff, because you were talking about us as a segregated city, and then as people are trying to get empowered and find voice, the way they get pushed aside, and how you're trying to create a voice right now. By the way, one little story about the Rams before we move to Dr. Amanda Boston. I think I might be the only person in Los Angeles who had as a babysitter a special teams player from the Rams. Yeah, he loved our kids, and so he was our babysitter when they were growing up. So that's my claim to the Rams. Dr. Boston, congratulations on being a doctor and a postdoctoral scholar, and I see you're heading off to Pitt as well here in the near future. Congratulations on that as well. I'm imagining that you can give us a bit of a comparative perspective on how race and racism have driven planning in New York and maybe affecting Los Angeles as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about that further with you. And thank you so much for the great intro. And thank you for having me, the lone New Yorker on the West Coast with y'all. Let me actually share my screen. I have some prepared remarks. Okay. So rather than a comparative view, and I'd love to get into that with the Q&A because I also have so much to learn from you. I actually want to give a sort of overview of the sort of racial and spatial ideologies that really bring Brooklyn and LA together. I know that so much of what's happening in Brooklyn is shaped by all sorts of place-specific and local histories and struggles, but I analyze and understand it in the context of broader power dynamics and policies that manifest all over the US and even abroad, including in Los Angeles. So I'm going to lay out that context for you, specifically the role that structural racism has played in urban planning and urbanization, and how folks on the ground are tying the problem of exclusionary redevelopment and gentrification to inequality across various areas of urban life. So, you know, an example of that shared history would be the practice of redlining, right? So we can sort of map the racial spatial inequality that was set in motion. I won't say set in motion, but was really institutionalized during the New Deal, because some of it was really just about institutionalizing existing inequality. And we can still really see those effects today. So urban planning and urbanization have been tied to racial and spatial dispossession from the very beginning, right? Literally the colonial encounter, European settlement, indigenous displacement, genocide, racial slavery, and the systems of extraction and domination that evolved from it. And so since then, public policy and private practice has maintained these sort of unequal racial spatial power relations, relegating people of different races to different places, but also, as I write here, assigning value to places based on that differentiation. And so you see, what we see looking throughout history is this enduring relationship between ideas of whiteness, profit, and progress that really become really dominant in our understanding of elite-driven development of cities, of rural places, of space in the US. And so over the past century and into the present, we see this dynamic has borne out in what psychiatrists Mindy Thompson-Fullove and Roderick Wallace call a persistent policy of serial forced displacement. And so they identify these policies that I have on this slide as a critical set that is really subjected affected communities to disruption, uncertainty. It's created power and resource imbalances that reverberate in every aspect of human life, from access to food, access to water, access to clean air, where you live, how you live, wealth, right? And so these policies create what I understand is a cumulative disadvantage. So it can't just be attributed to a single policy. We all love to talk about redlining, but we also have to understand all the things that have come since, right? So like you see here, urban renewal, deindustrialization, mass criminalization, the foreclosure crisis, right? So heightening vulnerability to risk, dislocation, interpersonal and institutional violence, undercutting rich legacies of resistance, because people always do resist. We have to remember that, right? But it's traumatized families and support networks, created barriers to wealth, semi-political power. And so much of the development we see, particularly the development we identify as gentrification, really relies on the effects of these policies, right? Depressed property values, physical blight, and sort of these physical indications of disorder. In New York, we had, broken windows policy, and I think some of that was transferred when you all got our police commissioner, right? Financial precarity, foreclosure. All of these are prerequisites to the kind of real estate speculation that we're seeing. And all of that just heightens the marginalization of vulnerable people. And that facilitates externally determined redevelopment. And it pushes communities into places of deeper disadvantage. And it severs all these ties in the names of always implicitly racialized notions of profit and progress. And so, my much hated Barclays Center, like I shake my fist at it every morning. But, in most cases, well, as daunting as these problems are seen, right, we can always look to the grassroots for some answers. And so when we saw the largest multiracial movement in history rise up in, last summer and continue into this year, we're really seeing that folks are linking the problems that we see of gentrification and other forms of exclusionary remaking of the city to issues of housing affordability more broadly, police violence, labor exploitation, healthcare access, educational inequality, political participation. And they're showing how these things are broadly consequential, yes, but they do have distinctly racial operations. And if we want to solve one, we need to address so much more, right, than the single problem or the way that we think of it in a singular fashion. And so during the Q&A, I hope we get to discuss the importance of keeping structural racism in the frame as we seek to understand the current issues we face and as we seek to develop comprehensive solutions.
Thank you very much, Amanda. What you just said reminded me a lot of times people will, after I give a talk about a big set of issues, they'll say, well, what's the single thing we should do? And I always say, well, the single thing we should do is to stop thinking there's one thing. So it's, as you're talking about, it's really overlocking systems. Cynthia, you've been at this for quite a while too. What's been the impact of racist planning of the past and the current day on the communities with which you work?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Boston. Those comments were great. And I think that really sort of underlines some of the processes that we've seen manifest themselves specifically in South Los Angeles over time. Certainly historically redlining and confining low-income communities of color to South Los Angeles, African Americans, Latinos, some groups of Asian Americans there for many years, led to certain also patterns of disinvestment, which are very much also racialized, as Dr. Boston pointed out. So I think we can divide up the effects into things that people didn't get that they should have gotten, things like parks that were never zoned into place, things like, and then I think with that, an attention to city services, which is not exactly the same as planning, but is very closely allied to it as you concentrate low-income people and then concentrate low-income people of color, services like streetlight repair, sidewalk repair, garbage pickup, all of those start to, coincidentally, in quotes, disappear. And then there's also the things that people did get that people in more affluent areas do not get. A lot of South Los Angeles was co-zoned between residential and industrial sites. There's a huge amount of ambient pollution, not only from manufacturing, which will sit right up cheek by jowl with residences, but also with the kind of pollution you get from trucks that are coming and going. Famously, we've seen freeways get, plowed through. I don't need to tell anyone in New York about the history of plowing freeways through places, but they've also been plowed through a lot of Los Angeles. Some of my family members who lived in South Los Angeles after being displaced during World War II and coming back and living in South LA, the places where they lived are now covered in freeway. So those are the sins of omission, the sins of commission that you tend to see as a result of these planning forces in low-income communities of color, like South Los Angeles, but others as well. And then I think, there's an overall cultural phenomenon that we see with the displacement that's coming in now to South Los Angeles after years of both, the wrong kind of attention or no attention at all, which is that often these communities, low-income communities of color, tend to get figured as kind of this terra nullius land, like nobody lives there, there's nothing there. We had one developer come in and say, we're going to do placemaking here, you'll finally have something, which is very insulting to people who've lived there for their whole lives and do have something and do feel that there's a community that lives there and has been really, trying to hold down hold everything down culturally and socially for many years through long years of neglect. Billie Eilish, I think, famously said that her family moved to Highland Park. I forget what she said. Something about nobody really lived there, which I think people who already did live there found, a little problematic. So those are some of the effects that we've seen. And I think some of the sort of the cultural framework in which those kinds of effects happen.
Thanks. There's sins of omission, sins of commission, and I think you're speaking a little bit to the sins of the profession of planning, what it has ignored and what it's led to. We spent a little bit of time talking about sort of what has been. Let's talk a little bit about what should be. And I'm going to turn to General Dogon, who can come off mute. What does Skid Row need? Why have previous policies not worked? And what are the kind of recommendations that y'all are making now?
Hey, can you hear me?
Can hear you fine, yeah.
Yeah. So what Skid Row needs is what every other neglected, poor, and oppressed community of color needs, right? Real grassroots leadership, right? That's wrapped in love. Like I say, LA is the most racist city west of the Mississippi. And you don't get to lead, that kind of rep leading the nation, in homelessness, police brutality, incarceration, by doing the right things, right? You get that kind of, numbers from doing everything wrong, right? So we already know that the policy, is something that just, really got to be addressed in a serious way. Because that's where we've been fighting the dust on. There's a lot of their policy, a lot of their racist policy, right? And so, for me, most definitely in the Skid Row community, when politics and politicians continue to be dishonest, then it's time for us to start creating some real grassroots, solutions. And I think George Floyd rebelled and showed us a lot. For when we take it to the streets and we stay in the streets, we win. Right, when we continue to try to play their game, then we lose. So for me, just like in all the community, we always say all the time, we know what we need in the community. Just like with we trying to get our Skid Row neighborhood council, we know exactly what we need. We know what we want. We know what's going to save us. And can't nothing stop us. And once we know what we need, we can't backtrack no more. We gotta keep moving forward, and sometimes we gotta take it to the streets, and when we take it to the streets, we gotta have that mentality that it's life or death for us. Because when you look at Skid Row, it was 3 homeless people dying a day in the city of Los Angeles, right? Now it's 5 a day. So we're talking about we become death row residents. It's death to us. You know what I mean? So when it's death for us, we ain't got no other choice but to fight back, right? And so that fight back, you know what I mean? It can't be, sometimes it got to be a hard fight. I'm going to put it that way. I mean, and we got to take the streets and we got to save the streets. And so that's where we are right now. You know what I mean? Is that we on that position to where we know what we got to do next.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Doug, I'm finally coming around to you, and hoping that you can also sort of pick up on this question about sort of specific policies that flow from the analysis that we've had of the problems and from the organizing that's empowering community voice in Skid Row, Little Tokyo, and Chinatown. What then specifically is the Central City United People's Plan calling for?
Yeah, thank you for the question and amazing sort of framing already, and really honored to be a part of this. Let me, before jumping into the wonky stuff, just say a word about the approach, which I think sort of ties back to a lot of what we heard in the previous answers. I think, you know, when we're thinking about the problems and the history of racist planning, I think a big part of that is who it is that gets to be considered an expert. And Manuel, you touched on this in a really important way in the beginning, but you know, that's been a driver of these harms. And I think that one thing that we know and that drives this coalition is that some of the best planning experts that we have are the people that have found a way to build community despite the exclusion, the redlining, the disinvestment, the criminalization, the forced banishment, all of the things that we know as part of the history. And so like, if you've been to LA Can's rooftop, for example, and you've seen that incredible community space in the heart of Skid Row, or if you've seen Sika's students out there running around doing asset mapping in Chinatown, then you know that these are people that know how to tap into those little intangible things that build those connections, that honor space and people, these things that planning really needs in order to work. And so I think there's this ironic way where one of the other really important impacts of inequitable planning has been this organic development of tremendous planning expertise in these communities that comes from resiliency and necessity. And so, you know, I think one of the things that we're trying to address through our policy recommendations and through our process is that, you know, the planning field needs to recognize the harm that it's created, absolutely, but it also needs to recognize that that harm has in turn created expertise. And so any work to repair that harm needs to start with honoring and listening to that expertise. And so that's kind of the guiding motivation that we brought to developing these policy recommendations that are, you know, detailed and wonky, but are fundamentally tethered to that vision and that expertise that exists in these neighborhoods that has historically been excluded and ignored from the planning process.
That's great. And I'm hoping you could just go a little wonky for a minute too, because again, one of the things I was the most impressed by, we often see community-based organizations produce a vision and general principles. You started talking about the zoning for 100% affordable housing, floor to area ratios, particular kind of community benefits programs. I mean, the details there are really amazing. Can you just give us a taste of that? Because this combination of voice and expertise, it's so authentic and so impressive in what I've been able to read.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we start with a vision, right? We start with this idea that planning is in many ways an opportunity to shift from a reactive stance to a forward-looking. What do we actually love about our community? What do we want to see more of? We build this cohesive vision. And then one of the things that, you know, that we can do as lawyers and the policy folks can come in and look for openings, right? We're not driving the priorities, but we can find the openings. Where are there existing tools that can be modified or repurposed? So for example, there is the density bonus concept is well established in planning, right? There's this idea that developers are allowed to build bigger buildings if they provide affordable housing. But we had all these priorities about community serving small businesses, legacy small businesses. So what if we took that concept and modified that tool to give incentives to projects that are providing space at reduced rent for community serving small businesses, defined in a way that reflects what local residents want to see come into their neighborhood. So modifying this planning tool to address that specific need. Another example, we looked at the TFAR program that's been a part of downtown Los Angeles, this really opaque and ineffective transfer of floor area rights program, and imagined, what if this thing that developers paid money into, what if that was instead directed specifically to community priorities? What if this was an opening for us to prioritize and fund things that you've never seen in a land use policy before? So we have tenant purchase of buildings. We have funding for seeding community land trusts, street vendor carts and commissaries, things that historically can't be included, have not been included in zoning, but we have this program that we could repurpose and call out those specific priorities and create funding for them. And then I think open space is another sort of area where we really wanted to get creative. It's not exactly revolutionary for planning to encourage the provision of open space, but what if that open space was paired with the things that people need? So incentives for open space that include phone charging stations, shade, 24/7 restroom access, resiliency centers to support people during heat waves and climate events, and thinking about how people actually use open space, and then putting forward a definition of publicly accessible open space that reflects that.
Great. Well, that was plenty wonky. I mean, I was pretty excited in my chair. Dr. Boston, this level of community participation and planning, can you talk a little bit about how frequent or rare it is? Because often planning seems like it's sort of planning at people rather than planning with people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would say the people are always going to talk back, right? And so it's always a matter of, are people going to listen, right? And so I know I always, the Barclays Center is this big thing for me, because the story of this thing is also kind of my intellectual coming of age, right? But I just remember the community and the public advocate, who is now the Attorney General of New York, Tish James, working with the community, coming up with a comprehensive plan, and then the politicians deciding to follow the money and stick with the developer, right? So like, there not being enough political will, but also not enough money to actually implement the community plans. And they host these town halls and say, yeah, give us your opinion, and don't do any of it. And then I've also seen more insidious, which is this veneer of multicultural inclusion. So again, in terms of the Barclays Center, I write a lot about the ways they incorporate Black expressive cultures like hip hop, graffiti, Basquiat, Biggie Smalls, Jay-Z, right? And there's an appearance of, and also, yes, work in the shadow of the Dodgers stadium. So this is supposed to be the realization of the post-war Dodgers multicultural dream, right? Because it's where O'Malley wanted to build Dodger Stadium and then went to LA. But anyway, you have this, they really put up Black culture and Black Brooklyn as like the beneficiaries of this thing, as though it was like a Robin Hood project, and that Jay-Z stole the riches from these developers and is redistributing them in Black Brooklyn. But if you see the racial and class turnover that has occurred on the backs of Black Brooklynites and many other marginalized people, we know that's not true. So again, I think that, there's always been exclusion, but I think now, particularly in the post-civil rights era, there's a necessary veneer, a multicultural veneer of inclusion that is more insidious, because it looks like it's for everybody. But when you look at the numbers and when you look at the losses, it's really not.
I'm wondering, Cynthia, if you could say something about this participation, but also talk a little bit about the bridge building that's gone on between 3 different communities to come up with a Central City United plan.
I think, well, starting with the bridge building, I mean, I think I've just been really impressed. We worked in South Los Angeles a long time on our community plans. And I think watching these 3 historically disenfranchised communities who have been disenfranchised in very different ways, and yet all along racial lines, it has all been this racialized disenfranchisement, come together to work on these problems has been really inspirational. And I feel like it has helped tie the city together tie the social justice groups that are interested in planning around the city together and thinking of addressing the community plan process as an important way to address racist planning processes throughout the city. And you know, I think there is a tendency, I really like what Dr. Boston said about trying to make racial inclusion around planning symbolic or representational. And while of course symbolism and representation are important, I think we always need to really look at the upstream determinants of racial disparities. And those are often material, often very wonky, often very inaccessible to the people who are going to most suffer the consequences of their enactment. And so, you know, I really think that the planning that's been done here by community organizations is really special.
And can you talk a little bit about what happened with the South LA People's Plan as well? Because that was bridge building. I mean, it's kind of, I'm having a progressive fantasy of understanding a People's Plan in South LA, the Central City United People's Plan, whether or not we can start doing that in Highland Park, where there's been people for a very long time, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about the South LA process?
Well, that was a long process and it took us about 10 years. And that wasn't, it was partly because the city kept having to reformulate its timeline. And so, I mean, I heard about it for years and years, literally almost half a decade, I think, before we even started to move on it. And in the end, you know, SAJE and many, many, many other community allies in the United Neighbors in Defense Against Displacement Coalition, called UNIDAD, which is a very cool acronym, if you ask me. We had gotten together over many years to try and get a lot of this community feedback and to get it then translated, you know, with the help of Doug Smith, who worked on that plan too, into community plans that would reflect the community's vision. And in the end, the city took on boarded almost 75%, I think, of the recommendations that came out of the community. So I would regard it as like a very successful multi-sector, place-based effort to do public planning. And the city, you know, won awards for that plan. The planning department did. So it's very much recognized, I think, within the profession as an accomplishment to do that. You know, in my view, I think both advocates and planners need to view themselves like physicians. You know, you don't want to charge into the room and announce that somebody needs a wooden leg and chemo and several of their organs removed. And the person's like, whoa, 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 I've got 2 legs and I need all my organs. And that I had just had a headache. You know, at the same point, it's not helpful if a planner walks into the room, is just like, why don't you just tell us what you want? Because you need somebody to make that active translation. When I say, you know, I'm having this problem in my community, somebody needs to be able to listen in a way that they can reformulate that as policy.
That's great. Thanks for the answer. And sorry if got a little note. I gave the impression that you were part of the Central City United. I was actually just asking you to comment on the bridging that went on there and the bridging that went on also in South LA. But again, I'm still having this fantasy about People's Plan in different parts of Los Angeles as these communities roll out. San Fernando Valley deserves its own People's Plan as well. And it looks like the common thread is Doug Smith. So although LA CAN was involved in at least the BHC coalition that helped put together the People's Plan. So it's there as well. General Dogon, would you mind commenting? And then we'll be moving to sort of question and answer a little bit too on the bridge building between the 3 different communities as you were trying to put together this plan, learning about the issues in Little Tokyo and Chinatown and educating others about the issues in Skid Row. Let's see, you're on mute.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Hearing now, perfect, yeah.
Yeah, so for sure. I mean, we've been working for years trying to unite, you know, people together in the People's Plan, you know, because we already know that that's where our fight is at. You know, together we stand, divided we fall. You know, we want to show that our community, you know, them is, you know, all built out of containment zones. You know, once upon a time, that's what they really was. And so, you know, we have a duty to fight, you know what I mean, and to uplift history, you know what I mean, to the point to where we become victorious in the end. And so with that said, yeah, we've been working to ensure that, you know, that we have a right to the land, because, you know, once you leave off the land these days, you ain't coming back. And your history is going to be gone with you, because they're going to get the right and tell your history, right? And so, you know, it's important that we stay here, that we preserve our history, you know, preserve our rights, you know, our legacy, you know, especially when you look at, you know, where Little Tokyo, when you look where Skid Row, and when you look where Chinatown is at, this is indigenous land in the beginning. And some of the first settlers that settled in this land, the Pico Indians and the B.D. Mason. A lot of people don't know who B.D. Mason, but she was a black woman, right? She bought her way out of slavery, right? And she was one of the first settlers into downtown over there where Overa Street is at right now. She have a little park that's dedicated to her across the street from the Grand Central Market on 4th Street, right? And so that's the legacy we're talking about. You know what I mean? That's what we're talking about preserving. It's a little small park, you know what I mean? Because they trying to wash Josh away her. They don't want people to see that or know that, right? So it's important that we let people know, you know what I mean, that we was here first, that we built this, that B.D. Mason had the first mission downtown, that she had the first shelter, she had the first soup lines, right? So it's important that we continue that fight. And if we let them zone us out, you know what I'm saying, or push us out, or whichever way they try to do it, then we lost. And so we right in the middle of this. We on a can't stop, won't stop mission. And so we in it to win.
Thank you. I have like a ton of more questions I could ask, but what I'm going to do is open it up for the audience to see if there's questions. To do that, I'm supposed to pass the mic over to Elena Seltzer from Southeast Asian Community Alliance. Elena, you can come up and on the screen.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to help moderate the questions a little bit. So I think at this time, if folks have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. That would be the best place to do it. But to get us started off, while you guys think of your questions, I'm going to go ahead with one. And this is to everyone. What would it mean to truly do planning that advances fair housing?
So I'll call on people. Cynthia, you thought about this for years.
What would it mean to, you know, we need to think about planning for housing outside of the profit box. And I think as long as we prioritize making money, I sometimes yell at people, you get one goal at a time. And, you know, as long as housing is mostly about making money and not about housing people, it's very hard to make housing people the priority, because it's everything else. It's an investment product, it's a hotel room, it's this, it's that other thing. Really what it needs to be, housing needs to be planned for as a place that people can live. And until we can get out of it also being a wealth building strategy for, you know, whoever the heck it is, I think we're going to have a really hard time with it. That was kind of a big answer. And now I'm going to pass it back to Mem.
Well, it really speaks to the whole question of social housing and why we moved toward market housing instead of social housing, which would solve a lot of these problems in the first place. Dr. Boston, any comments on that question?
Sure. I think one thing out of many is you have to penalize these folks who are not doing right by tenants. So, for example, there are yearly lists of the worst slumlords in the city. You got these folks on the list 10, 15 years in a row. It's never just one property. It's a whole slew of them across neighborhoods. And it's like, come on, like do something, right? So I think like penalties for people who are keeping people in, you know, substandard living conditions and just treating people horribly, like they're not human. I think one thing is like actually making it cost to violate people in that way. And also the way that there are incentives for developers, there should be taxes on developers who would rather maintain a vacant housing stock than contribute to some sort of easing of the housing crunch. Incentivize filling these homes with people who need homes, right? So I think more incentives and more punishments for folks who aren't doing right by other human beings, essentially.
Doug, do you want to touch on that question? Maybe saying more than sue their asses off?
Oh, well, I got nothing then. No, I a couple thoughts. I mean, I think one, to tie this back to some of the things that General Dogon was talking about in Skid Row. I mean, I think we had the first hearing for the downtown community plan last week, and it was interesting to me to hear a lot of callers calling in and voicing opposition to something that's in the plan called the IX1 district. And this is a very intimidating sounding term, but it's really just a zone. It's really just an industrial zone that covers part of Skid Row that limits housing development to 100% affordable and supportive housing. And there was a lot of opposition to that concept, and the opposition was rooted in language of fair housing. It was rooted in, avoiding a concentration of poverty, decentralizing. And I think in many ways that is kind of a straw man false choice, as if we could only prioritize affordable housing in one location. If we prioritize it in Skid Row, we can't prioritize affordable housing elsewhere. And that's absolutely not true. We can do both. And I think we have to do both to actually meet the crisis at its scale. And so I think it's interesting one of the ways that we, prioritize and actually do fair housing is to, recognize that this does not mean that you cannot prioritize the needs of historically marginalized and low-income communities of color. And you can concentrate and build affordable housing where it's needed. And then also take that next step of breaking down the barriers to affordable housing in those historically exclusionary communities, those areas that were, that by virtue of redlining and the legacy of redlining have low density single family zoning and other tools to explicitly exclude people. And so I think, we've talked about, can we do a people's plan across the city? That's great, but we can't only do people's plans in low income neighborhoods. We also need to be breaking down barriers to affordable, deeply affordable housing in these high resource exclusionary communities. We have an opportunity to do that through the city's housing element process right now. And I think that's going to be an important analog or complementary movement or effort to these people's planning efforts, so that we can, do community-centered planning in sensitive communities, neighborhoods that are vulnerable to gentrification and displacement, and at the same time remove those barriers that are in other parts of the city, so that we can have those things work in tandem.
It's great. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, unless Yelena is going to correct me. So if not, I would ask another question, but go ahead.
Oh, we have a couple of questions.
Okay, good.
So this one's for Doug. Is it more important that wealthy developers get more profit, or more important to have community benefits for the most vulnerable residents?
I think, to answer that question, I think, community benefits are most important, but I think that I would say that market rate development has a role to play in addressing the affordable housing crisis, and it can't be the only strategy. We absolutely need other tools. I think Manuel mentioned social housing. As an aside, I would say check out SB 679. Is a bill that's going to create an LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency that would have the power to raise resources and coordinate a regional approach to social housing. And we absolutely need those tools. But market rate developers also have a role to play. And I don't think it's as simple as just hoping that new market supply will cause older units to filter down to extremely low income households. We can actually have mixed income, inclusive development where a project sets aside a percentage of deed restricted affordable housing. And the CCU People's Plan and the draft plan contemplates doing this with a value capture program. This is another one of those technical wonky terms, but there's an ability to look at zoning, understand that decisions about zoning create wealth. If you take a piece of property that's zoned for 25 units of housing and you change that zoning, it's a public action that changes that zoning to allow 50 or 100 units, you've just created wealth. And we have the opportunity to capture some of that new wealth creation and redirect it back to the community in the form of on-site affordable housing requirements. And so there's an opportunity to do that so that the market rate developers are part of the solution. They're part of the holistic, all of the pieces we need, but they play a role. And we can do that through mechanisms that finally acknowledge and understand that zoning has this impact and this power, and that the public have the ability to demand some of that return in the form of community benefits. And I think there's an opportunity to really do that in a meaningful way in this plan.
Elena, more questions?
Yes, we have a question for you guys. So if you found yourself in a place of a decision maker, how would you balance all the competing interests? How could or would you prioritize racial justice within the constraints of a city bureaucracy? How can our elected officials and leaders fight against systemic racism?
Well, I'm going to turn that question to Dr. Boston, partly because she lifted up some of that early on, but also, heck, you're a postdoctoral scholar. You should have all the answers.
Can you actually repeat that question for me?
Definitely. Yes, definitely. So the question is, if you found yourself in place of a decision maker, how would you balance all the competing interests? How could you prioritize racial justice within the constraints of a city bureaucracy? How can our elected leaders fight against systemic racism?
It's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about balanced racial justice in a city bureaucracy, I think that in a place like New York, like LA, I think racial justice and racial inequality is at the heart of just about every major concern that the city has, right? If we're talking about an employment crisis, if we're talking about COVID, right? So many things are really stratified along race and have racialized outcomes, even if everyone is affected by them, right? And so I think that for that reason, because it is so, such a highly determinative factor, you've got to have these conversations. I don't think there's racial justice or something good. I think that's a false choice to have to make. Now, what was the last question?
It was really about getting political leaders to pay attention.
Yes. So the last part,
they act like they care about it when they're running, right? I think it's, everything that has moved us into the direction of racial justice or any other form of justice has been people power. Keep the pressure on and don't let up. And that's really it. I think pressuring the officials to do the right thing. I think finding ways of interest convergence. So, making things happen from people who might have different interests that happen to be aligned in a way that genuinely furthers racial justice. It definitely involves, like I said, finding out where we can meet common ground with people. But it's going to take pressure. It's going to take people power. Nothing is going to be given. Everything is going to be hard won.
Pressure and people power. This sounds like also a place for General Dogon to comment. Could you talk a little bit about organizing and putting pressure on bureaucracies and political figures to make sure that the concerns of Skid Row and other communities get paid attention to?
Yeah, sure. So for me, most definitely, since 2005, about the last 16 years, I've been organizing in the city. And I would most definitely say about 70% of my time has been spent, right, trying to convince city leaders and policymakers that what you're going to do is a bad idea, right? Now, I know, that for me, with my little bit of experience and what I have since when I first got involved in a fight, right? when I got involved, it was 2005, and the city was making a big decision. It was they had just got dinged in federal court on a lawsuit called Jones versus the city, and it was I think it was the most pivotal point in the history of Los Angeles were facing a homeless decision, because they was forced to allow people to sleep on the streets from 9 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And at that point, right there, I was telling people, I was telling the politician, I remember I was telling Jan Perry, and I was telling him, I was saying, look, you done just voted to allow people to sleep on the streets. Ain't you going to start having some conversation around creating new policy around housing? What about the basic things, right? Because the city has to build 1,200 units of permanent support housing before they can uplift the agreement, right? And so I said, until you can do that, that's going to be a while, you know. I said, people need basic things to live on the street with, right? And so our fight started off, you know, believe it or not, with Jose Huizar just trying to bring basic resources to Skid Row. I mean, we had campaigns just to fight to get trash cans, right? Things that you will find naturally in other communities, we found ourselves on the battlefield for, right? And so it was like, so I made the point about 2005 and the homeless crisis because the city had the position right there. If I was a politician right there, in my mind, I would have said, okay, we just got found guilty in federal court. We just had to allow people to sleep on the streets, right? This should have told me, okay, it's time for us to build affordable housing. They didn't. They turned around and they invested in policing. And for the next 10 years, in the Safer City Initiative, they would try to police their way out of homelessness. And the time, the energy, the resources that LA Can spent in the last 10 years fighting the Safer Cities Initiative to get it out of our community, to whoop Bratton. So it took a lot of resources. And so I would just say in the community, for people that's out there organizing, you know, we got to stay strong. You know, it's going to be a fight. To this day, I have very few, I would say, respect and I would say faith in politicians, right? Philip Austin, the rapporteur, I toured him around Skid Row and around the city. In his report, he said that Skid Row had conditions that are worse than third world refugee camps. And it wasn't because it was no resources. It was all because of lack of political will. So that falls back on sometimes on the organizers too. You know, sometimes I think in my mind, oh, we should have did this, we should have did this, we should have that. But when I look at everything that we did, we done chalked off everything you can do. You know, outside of just drawing the sword, you know, and just running up in the city hall, we done did everything that you could do. So, you know, it falls up on political will, you know, a lack of political will. And so most definitely the fight,
Thank
you know, it's with him. So, I would most definitely say we got to continue to fight on that area.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Because you may not be seeing this, your mention of whipping Bratton in a political fight got a big smile from your sister from New York. So I guess these big cities share. Doug, I want to ask a question, and then we're going to start closing pretty soon because we want to end on time. Cynthia was describing the fact that the city sort of responded to the People's Plan out of South LA by adopting parts of it and moving in a positive direction, not everywhere where the People's Plan out of South LA wanted to go, but picking up on part of it. And then, as she mentioned, getting an award for it, being able to pat themselves on the back. How's that process going, particularly as the city has been revising? Have parts of the People's Plan from Central City United been able to make their way into the conversation and into policy documents?
Yes, and in really important ways. And I think that you know, the planning department has been, you know, we've been having meetings with the department for a couple of years at this point, and I have to give them credit for being really responsive and really engaging. And we've had good dialogue, good conversation. They've been really good at, I think, trying to understand and listen and respecting the expertise that we're bringing from that lived experience. There are things that have been incorporated that we're really excited about. Nothing is guaranteed. We're sort of halfway through the public hearing process. So things could be added, things could be taken out at the Planning Commission, and then again when it gets to the City Council committees. So nothing is written in stone quite yet, but some of the things that we are proud and excited have made their way into at least the draft plan include, I was referencing earlier this change to the TFAR program and this adoption of a community benefits fund, which will raise revenue to be used specifically for some of these priorities that came out of the CCU organizing space. So tenant purchase, seating land trusts, street vending, commissaries, and carts. These are things that are going to now have resources and things that you don't typically see in planning documents. And that has been embedded and incorporated into the draft plan, taking specific recommendations and ideas from CCU. The community serving small business benefits is another area where I think there have been really good conversations between the experts from Little Tokyo Service Center, Little Tokyo Community Council, working with small businesses in Little Tokyo, folks in Chinatown working with those small businesses, really understanding what it is to be a legacy small business in these types of neighborhoods. What does that look like? And then crafting definitions and incentives that can support those. And so those provisions are currently in the draft plan. We have a lot of policy language. I think you can think about community plans as having two main parts. There's a sort of policies and programs which set this aspirational vision for the future. And then there's the zoning, which is the literal sort of rules for development. And in the policy document space, I think there's a lot of really important language that comes directly from the organizing and expertise of CCU, things that prioritize better access to hygiene and restrooms in Skid Row neighborhood. There's a provision that came directly from the organizing in Skid Row about recognizing that the trauma that comes from sweeps and actually creating a program where you would hire residents of Skid Row to do some of that work around bulky items instead of the heavy-handed approach that the city commonly uses, which results in the unjust confiscation of personal property. And so, there's language in there about avoiding hostile architecture. And so like small little design things that actually have a really big impact on making people feel unwelcome in their own community, and being able to tackle that and get that language into the plan has been really important and really exciting. There are also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the things that aren't in there yet that we really hope will be incorporated there. I don't want to take up too much more time, but just to shout out a couple of ways that we think the affordable housing incentives need to be strengthened. I was mentioning there's some good incentives to create mixed income affordable housing. However, those incentives also include an option to provide moderate income units and above moderate income units, which, above moderate is literally 6 figures. So, not that those housing units aren't important, but we have really valuable land use incentives. They need to be devoted to creating the deepest affordability levels. And we also want to make sure that the adaptive reuse program, which has historically been a big driver of housing downtown, currently doesn't have, the downtown adaptive reuse program doesn't have any affordability component to it. And that's something that really needs to, we've moved adaptive reuse to the rest of the city. We've put affordable housing into it. And yet for some reason, we don't yet have affordable housing in the downtown adaptive reuse.
Yeah, and Doug, I think one of the reasons why that's super critical is maybe 20 or 30 years ago, you could have justified it because there wasn't a lot of housing there. Yeah. But at this point, what looked like giving the benefit of the doubt reasonable in an earlier era isn't really reasonable now. So key point. Elena, I'm gonna start moving to a close, but is there one last question you wanted to lift up?
Give me 1 second here. Sure, yes. So sorry, I got confused. So question is for Amanda and Cynthia. So both of you have worked in communities organizing to fight development pressures and displacement that was specifically created by a development of a major sports arena. How have the communities been able to extract value from these markets, and what was sufficient or what wasn't?
Of course, my default answer is none at all. I mean, there is the emotional value of having a home team, as you may have seen the past couple of days with the Nets. But really, I mean, when you look at it, the big promises of jobs, they are seasonal jobs, and no one was working during COVID. They're jobs where folks don't work 40-hour weeks, they don't have benefits. The housing promises have gone unfulfilled. The affordable housing, there was a fair housing lawsuit to even give local communities preference in the development surrounding the Barclays Center, which is called Pacific Park. And actually they had the EB-5 visa program, which you all, I'm sure, are dealing with in LA. And they basically did financial gerrymandering. There was a promise of assisting with basically job creation for underserved communities. And they actually did this weird thing where they branched out into Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, which are two historic Black communities, to show that they needed, funding to do this work. But really, they're located in Prospect Heights, which is basically a majority white first wave gentrified neighborhood. So the benefits have really been negligible, and there's still a great need in terms of both jobs, not just any jobs, but jobs that would give some sort of upward mobility rather than turning long-term working class and poor residents into a permanent service class. Definitely need jobs and affordable housing that this thing hasn't provided.
Thanks. Cynthia, my sense is that we've done a little better than that in Los Angeles, but that there's a lot of gaps too.
I think that's right. And I'm a big fan of something's better than nothing. And we did get some things out of, I think, the Staples Center Community Benefits Agreement. But, I would have to say it is not ideal. Ideally, you would be having more community serving development rather than trying to have something else planned that's probably not best for the community, as Dr. Boston said, and then trying to extract stuff out of that post facto. There's article after article after article written in sports sociology on how bad stadiums are for communities, and yet our elected officials keep building them. And I don't know if it's just that no one on staff goes to the library and says, hey, there's like 80 articles on how terrible this is, maybe we shouldn't do it, or if it's just that people don't care. I'm really kind of baffled by that. But I think that there has been a steady stream of jobs that are union, that are living wage jobs that have been funneled to local residents. There was some money that came out of that, but overall, I would not really advocate for stadium building as a way to generate economic development in a community.
Good point. So we have one last question to close. This is a really good panel, which means that no matter what I ask, you're going to make your last point anyway. So feel free to ignore me. But it's come up in the chat too, which is, one way to think about this is, how do we do all of this in the context of a market capitalist system? How can you actually achieve racial justice when the system has been designed to make profit for developers? And then a lot of the so-called problems we see are not bugs in the system, but features. They're actually just what was expected to happen. General Dogon, you get to go first. And I should have said that so you'd have time to unmute.
Most definitely, we got to take it to the streets and stay in the streets. They can't do nothing when we in the streets. You already know that, right? We're going to shut it down. I think the answer to that question is shut it down, right? As long as we're in the streets, shut it down. And so I'm going to end with shut it down.
You know what? That's consistent with some of your other answers, so I really appreciate it. Love you. Thank you for being on. We got a few more minutes.
Thank you for this. Yeah.
Doctor, I know you're wrestling with this in your research and your activism. What's possible in the current context? And do we just need to break open this current system? And that was for Dr. Boston.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, you muted yourself briefly there. I would say, I mean, anything is possible. There are incredible constraints that we could not have imagined, but I'm excited for some of the progressive movements taking place in New York City. Sadly, not the one for mayor just yet, but I'm excited for some of the more progressive leadership in terms of city council, public advocate. I think that and I think the movements have their work cut out for them. But again, like these problems aren't going anywhere and so many people are affected by them. It doesn't feel like it's not just, you know, the middle class displacing the working classes. It's the middle classes being displaced, right? It's basically the cities are being remade for newer, more affluent, increasingly more affluent residents, right? And so I think we're really understanding this as a problem that does affect everybody, and the gentrification is coming to crush you too. And so I think that once as people increasingly understand that this matters for all of us, I'm hoping that momentum for the movements across the country build and that we see some real change. So I'll never say anything's impossible. We hope and we fight.
Cynthia, your thoughts on this question about how we achieve equity?
I think we have to change the system. I think that's basically what General Dogon and Dr. Boston said. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, I guess I would say. It is extremely reasonable that and often reasonable means impossible in the system, but I don't think it is. I mean, if you look at places like Vienna, which have a very high proportion of social housing, places like Singapore, very high proportion of social housing. There's a lot of other industrialized countries that have a lot more supports for tenants and a lot more supports for people seeing housing as an infrastructure project like roads or schools or anything else that we manage to build on a regular basis, in a way that's substantially more equitable than we do with housing. So I think it's totally possible, and we just have to think outside the profit box that we've got ourselves into. And I think that means thinking about planning decisions as ethics decisions, not just technical decisions. When you build a city, it's one of the most impactful things you can do about how people live. And those are ethics decisions. And I really appreciated the question about competing interests, because we have to see these not as a series of competing equal interests, but as some people who are trying to make a lot of money at other people's expense. It's not a competing interest. It's should I be able to super exploit all of these low income people of color? The answer to that is no, and it doesn't really matter if your interest is in doing that, because that's not a legitimate interest.
I want to tie something that both of you just said, which is that if you also look at those places with social housing, their economies are stronger because people feel more secure, more stable, both who are renters and who are owners in those kind of places. And so there's a kind of false trade-off put between equity and prosperity, when really what Cynthia's posing, and I think Dr. Boston as well, is, and actually I should have said Dr. Strathmann as well, because Cynthia's got a PhD, which is this idea that somehow coddling the 1% is actually going to produce prosperity for all of us, when in fact what we need to do is to restrain the top, to lift the bottom, and to grow the middle. Doug, your answer to this question, what's possible in capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first I would just co-sign all the other responses around, none of this is going to happen without the direct action and organizing and being in the streets, and that's fundamental. And I think, so that's the key. And then within the confines of the planning system, I have a somewhat optimistic answer, but not an overly optimistic answer, I guess. I mean, I wish that there was this clear 3-step, 4-step blueprint to undo the systemic racism that's inherent and transition away from being in service of speculation and gentrification and complicity and move to this racial justice framework. But, it's not going to happen overnight in the planning field. but I do think that planning is still an important space to fight for these principles. And one of the first things is to just acknowledge, and this is sort of, I think, touching back on a previous question, that there's this impulse to balance competing interests and be pragmatic in the planning space. And I think that balancing interests is not always in harmony with racial justice and equity. And sometimes you need to decide to move forward with equity, which means prioritizing those that have been most harmed, which inherently means that if there's an interest that's oppositional to that, then it's going to be deprioritized. And that's not punishment, that's equity. And as Manuel's been telling us for years and years and years, that's actually good for our economy and good for our overall well-being as a whole. And so there needs to be some intentional decisions to not always seek that middle ground, but to actually prioritize equity in the decisions. And then, in doing this work and doing the organizing and the advocacy, I think of the emergent strategy model, right? This idea that patterns repeat at scale. And, CCU is building from work that's been done before, and hopefully something cool will build from this. And I think we think about, we've done environmental impact analyses for projects for generations. So CCU said, what if we did a racial impact analysis for this whole plan, right? We're building on that concept, and maybe that leads to an even deeper interrogation of systemic racism in other systems, right? We talked about the Unidad Coalition back when it was called FICAGE in Figueroa. I always mess this up, but the Figueroa Communities for Economic Justice. But right, I know, right? Pioneering the community benefits agreement, right? And then they said, well, what if these community benefits were just policy instead of fighting site by site? And so they launched the People's Plan campaign. Now CCU builds from this, right? So what can be next? How can we keep building? So I don't think we're solving racism in the downtown community plan alone, but we can create the conditions and the better foundations from which to keep building. And I think that's worth the fight.
Well, I want to help us close on time, but I want to end where I started. That what CCU has done is remarkable. It's reflecting and it's building on what other groups have done as well, but it's reflecting this deep anti-racist commitment and a vision that people have a right to the city. They have a right to live where they want to and to build their communities. That this is a unique instance of 3 communities that are very distinct and very different, but have been able to find common ground and been able to find common language on a plan, and they're not going anywhere. So they will fight to make sure that vision gets realized. And third, again, very thrilling, because while it's got that vision and that rhetoric, the ability to talk about TFAR and zoning and all of that wonderful planning as a second language is reflected there. And it's driven not just by the experts that got brought in, but the expertise at the community level to be able to have those discussions as well. So I applaud the work that CCU is doing, and am dreaming about how we scale to people's plans that work across multiple neighborhoods, across the city of Los Angeles, in New York as well, and eventually our nation. And with that, let me turn things over to Jessa McCormick from the Liberty Hill Foundation, who will sign us off.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of our panelists today. I hope everyone is feeling as kind of rejuvenated as I am right now. It's a good conversation if you have to stand up halfway through because you're just so into it and you can no longer sit down. I definitely had to do that. So a big shout out to everyone today. And thank you, of course, to CCF for co-sponsoring this event. This is a super important conversation, and we would be remiss to not end with a couple of calls to action. So someone said earlier in the event that there's not one thing you can do after this. There are many things, and luckily for you all, I have a list. So the first thing that I need you all to do is go to Twitter right now and follow @CCU People's Plan. I'm going to put it in the chat. And then the next thing you can do is go to centralcityunited.org. I'll also put that in the chat. and endorse the people's plan. Now, my next couple of things all involve public comment, which is one of my favorite things to do, and I hope it's one of yours as well. So the first thing you can do is tomorrow morning, the City Planning Commission is doing a report back on their Equity Day, which was back in January. So you should tune in tomorrow and provide public comment in favor of centering racial justice and BIPOC communities in the planning process. And if you do it tomorrow, this is great practice for August 26th at the next City Planning Commission meeting, when you'll actually be hearing a report back on the DTLA 2040 plan. This is when the plan will be heard at the City Planning Commission, and public comment is super important. If you want more information, you can contact Grant at Little Tokyo Service Center. Grant, if you want to put your contact information in the chat, that would be great so people can reach out to you. And then the last thing, hopefully you've already done this since you've been listening to this conversation for the past hour or so. You should look up all of these organizations and support them in whatever way you can. So I'm going to copy this and put it in the chat. There's, of course, the Marin Institute at New York University. There's the USC Equity Research Institute, and of course, SAJE, SAJE.net, and LA CAN, LA Community Action Network, cangress.org. Go to these websites, follow them on all the social media you have so you can stay involved. We need you in this fight, and I hope that you're inspired by today's conversation. Thanks, everyone.